All right, as promised, we are going to start roughly right on time. I'm Katie Mascalunas. I'm the Director of Events and Special Projects at NCVC. Thank you all so much for joining us for our first in our new webinar series, Countdown to Boston, our National Training Institute webinar series. Our first webinar that we're so excited about is Making Victims' Rights a Reality, a national perspective on emerging victims' rights issues. Next slide, please. So just a couple housekeeping notes. This webinar is being recorded. You will get the recording afterwards, and you're welcome to share that with your colleagues. It'll also be posted on the National Center's YouTube page, so you can access it that way as well. If you're having any technical issues, please send a private chat to Dashiell Coleman. He should be one of the hosts or panelists on our team, and he can help you out with that. We are not doing CE credits or attendance certificates for this seminar. Live captioning is also available if you need that. If you click on show captions at the bottom of your screen, that should enable the captioning. Again, if you have technical questions, please send those to Dashiell and he can help. And then if you have questions during the course of the webinar, please put them in the Q&A section, not the chat. We will not be monitoring the chat, but we will be monitoring the Q&A, and our presenters have accounted for about 10 to 15 minutes of questions at the end of the session. So if you put those all in there, we'll go through them at the end. Next slide. And as I mentioned, this is part of our NTI webinar series. We would love for all of you, if you haven't been before or if you've been many times, to join us at the 2023 National Training Institute. We're in Boston this year from September 6th through 8th. We have a full slate of fantastic workshops over 3 days. We have CE credits available. And right now you can register at the standard rate through August 2nd. If you have your smartphone handy, you can scan this QR code to take you directly to the registration page. And if you have any questions about the conference, feel free to contact us at our general email, which is nationaltraininginstitute@victimsofcrime.org. And next month's webinar, we're also equally excited about. It's Serving and Supporting LGBTQ+ Survivors of Intimate Partner Violence, presented by the National LGBTQ Institute on Intimate Partner Violence. We just opened registration for that earlier this week, and we are filling up quickly. So if you would like to sign up, please make sure that you do so. We'll have emails going out after this session with a link to register. And now I'm going to turn it over to our wonderful panelists from the California Victims Resource Center, Miriam and Anna.
Thank you so much, Krista, for the introduction. I'm sorry, Katie, for the introduction, and good morning or good afternoon, everybody, depending on where you are. We're based out of California, so it's still 11 o'clock, but so excited to be here. And thank you for the National Center for Victims of Crime for putting on this really important webinar series and for inviting us to be the first webinar in the series. So my name is Miriam El-Menshawi. I'm the Executive Director of the California Victims Resource Center, which is located at McGeorge School of Law. And I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Anna, who will be co-presenting with me to introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Anna Franco, and I am a graduate legal assistant here with the California Victims Resource Center.
So a little bit about what we do at the California Victims Resource Center. We were actually established in 1984. We are mandated by penal code here in California. We're located at a law school at University of the Pacific, McGeorge School of Law's campus, and we provide services to victims of all crimes at all stages of the criminal justice system by operating a statewide hotline and website where victims and their families and service providers can call to get information about victims' rights and also get connected with resources. We have no qualifying criteria. Anybody can contact us through our website or the hotline. So I did run into some technical issues myself. I did try to put together a poll, but I don't think it's going to work. So the first poll was just asking what state you're joining us from. If you would not mind adding that to the chat, we will go ahead and be happy to hear from where we have folks joining us from. And Anna, if you can monitor that and share, that would be great.
Yeah, it seems like we have people from all over the country, the country. We have a lot: Boise, let's see, Colorado, North Carolina, Washington, Idaho, Wisconsin, California, Nevada, South Carolina, Mississippi.
Wow. Awesome. Awesome. So it's exciting to hear that we have folks from many states around the country. And of course, victims' law is going to be different in each and every state. So we'll have a general discussion about victims' rights and issues based on that. And then once again, this poll unfortunately is not working, but wanted to know what your role is. Are you a community-based advocate or system-based advocate, law enforcement, attorney, mental health professional, crime victim or survivor, or other? And if you can go ahead and put that in the chat as well, and Anna will be reading that to us.
We have a lot of community-based advocates. Let's see, mental health professional,
Perfect.
government-based. Yeah.
Okay, great. So a nice wide range of folks joining us today. So we have people that are really familiar with victims' rights and others who may not be as familiar. So for those who are familiar, please excuse me for kind of going down to the basics a little bit, just so that everybody's kind of on the same page. And for those who know nothing, please are not as familiar with victims' rights, please feel free to connect with us after if you need some more information. I did want to start off with a trigger warning because we are going to be discussing a story today that may be difficult and triggering for some. I do want to make sure that you're taking care of yourself. So if when I start talking about the story, you can just step away. It'll be 2 or 3 minutes and then you can rejoin us. So in order for us to appreciate how far we've come in the victims' rights movement, I want to take us back so that we can understand where we were and how far we have come and all the progress made. So back in colonial times, victims actually used to prosecute their own cases. There was no uniform prosecutorial or law enforcement systems. So when somebody was harmed by another person, they would go out, collect evidence, hire an attorney, find a magistrate that would overhear the case, and they were there front and center in the criminal justice system. Over time, government felt like they should be playing a bigger role in investigating and then ultimately prosecuting people that harmed, because harm to one person ultimately causes harm to the whole community. So they took over that role. So the victim went from being front and center of this process to getting kicked out, and their role really shrunk. So initially we had the parties that were harmed were the victim, the parties to this proceeding. The victim was a party, and then the defendant was the other party. And then as the state started taking over that role, victims kind of got sucked into the state. So they became basically an appendage of the state, and their voice was filtered through the prosecution, which was representing the entire state. And it became so bad that the U.S. Supreme Court in dicta stated that a victim lacked interest in the prosecution of their criminal case. So can you imagine that? Can you imagine being a victim of a crime and being told that you have no interest in the prosecution of the case? This is where you would actually a lot of times learn about what was happening in the case, and you want to be there to see the prosecution unfold, hear the types of evidence that's presented, and see the person that harmed you being held accountable. So there are significant issues when people are not included, and Anna's going to talk about some of those issues.
Yeah, so what happens to victims when they're not included in the criminal justice process, right? Victims are the ones that are experiencing the crimes. They get catapulted into the system. And so unfortunately, what we're seeing is that there's very little participation of them in the actual system. And so what ends up happening is that there's a loss of confidence in the system, but also system players. A lot of the times we hear that, you know, that they're not understanding why their attorney, often referring to the district attorney, why they're not, you know, taking the case, how they would like to handle the case, or are not taking them into consideration, which ultimately leads to loss of trust in the system, especially if, you know, their views and how they would like the case to be prosecuted is different. And often that leads to fewer reported crimes. If victims feel like they're not a part of the system, then why even report, right? And ultimately that results in taking away the power of the victim, because now we've stripped them of this opportunity to participate.
So of course, seeing how unfair this was, victim advocates, and lawmakers started working together to pass laws to ensure that victims had a voice in the process and had a way to meaningfully participate. And they also created a lot of programs. So these are some of the programs that were created in the 1970s and 1980s in response to victims being excluded. And as you can see, you know, we have a wide array of programs being started, including the National Center for Victims of Crime, which is hosting this webinar, which was established in 1985. We were established as the Victims Resource Center around the same time. And a lot of states were passing statutory rights for crime victims. And the goal really in passing these laws was to give victims an independent way to participate in the process, an independent way to get information and to provide input. So why is it important to make sure that victims have these rights and that they are included in the criminal justice system?
So first and foremost, we should include victims in the criminal justice system to ensure that they have a voice in the system, right? And I'll talk a little bit about this in a few more slides, but victims' rights is about the process, not necessarily the result. So if it is about the process, we want to make sure that they have meaningful participation in this system. And to do that, it's either through fairness. Like I said before, victims don't choose to become victims of a crime. They get catapulted into the system. A lot of the times, especially if we're dealing with immigrants, the systems from their home countries vary from the system that we have here in the US. So there's a lack of knowledge, and then it's not fair, right? They're the ones that have experienced the crime, but now we're telling them they're not even a party to the case. Now the person who is going to be prosecuting is the state who's looking out for the community as a whole, not necessarily, you know, the victim. And then also through dignity, we want to make sure that, you know, we're respectful of them and we treat them appropriately. Respect, which oftentimes gets overlooked in the system, and not because, you know, community-based advocates or system-based advocates necessarily that's their intention, but oftentimes with the amount of workloads that we all have, we overlook victims or maybe are not as thorough as we should be in explaining actually what their participation in the system would look like. And then also to avoid secondary victimization, which I'll go over in a couple more slides, and to prevent victim alienation. So touching a little bit about avoiding secondary victimization, which we often see happen. You know, when a victim becomes a victim of a crime, they're catapulted into the system, as I've mentioned before. And what happens? They're continuously reliving the crime. They have to disclose this to law enforcement. They have to also talk now to the investigator, to the DA, when they're looking for services. It's a story that they have to continuously tell and have to relive and experience. And so to help in avoiding secondary victimization, that's where we can step in and actually inform them about their rights and actually guide them through the process, because the victim's experience in the criminal justice system can really vary depending on the participation and how involved they are. Their feelings can range from having a positive experience to being a horror story when they're or not being heard. Next slide, please, Marianne. And then also to prevent victim alienation. And current studies have shown that right now, victims do not necessarily want to report to law enforcement. They feel if they do report to law enforcement, either their case isn't going to be taken seriously, it's not going to be forwarded to the district attorney's office, or from past experiences, law enforcement are not able to help or intervene. And so, and then we, you know, if the case does get reported to the district attorney's office and now the case is there, if the prosecutor, you know, based on the standard that they have to meet, are not able to prosecute the case, and the victim doesn't understand why, that creates, you know, distrust in them and in the system, especially if charges are reduced or dropped. And ultimately, it leads to victims lacking control in the system, because now we've taken a crime that has happened to them and stripped them of that and made it about the state and the community as a whole, not necessarily them. And then if they're not included, it's a frustrating process for them. And then to further, there's a lot of misconceptions and studies where people have stated that it's better to not include victims in the criminal justice system because it will traumatize them again, having to go through the process, having to relive their story. But that ultimately is a decision that should be left up to the victim, and leaving them the option as to whether or not they want to participate, right? Informing them that they have the option to do so, informing them what the process would look like. They should, like somebody said in the chat, yes, they should have a voice and a choice. And their experience can really depend on having the ability to meaningfully choose, whether, when, how, and to what extent they want to meaningfully participate in the system. It should be a choice that's up to them, not a decision that anybody should be making on their behalf. And as I mentioned before, victims' rights are a lot about the process, not necessarily the result. Unfortunately, they cannot, prosecute their cases and determine how they want the case to end, but they should have the meaningful participation in the process and be able to exercise their rights as much or as little as they'd like.
Thank you, Anna. So as states were taking all of those things into consideration and passing laws to ensure that victims had the opportunity to participate, did that mean that victims had justice? What do you guys think justice means for victims? If you could please go ahead and put that in the chat. I apologize about our poll not working. So if you guys can start adding, what are victims looking for in terms of justice? What does justice mean for victims? And Anna, if you can read some of those back to us.
I'm seeing fairness, conviction, accountability, safety, protection, being heard, justice.
Perfect. Yeah. So go ahead. I'm sorry.
Sorry. Holding perpetrators accountable, equality, closure.
Perfect. And that's a lot of what victims' rights is about. And of course, not justice doesn't mean the same thing for every single victim, right? Some victims do want the person to be held accountable to the highest extent. Other victims just want to understand why. So, to them, maybe like a restorative practice will be more meaningful. But a lot of them are looking to be dealt with in a fair way, to be treated respectfully as they're going through, to be protected, as some of our colleagues online said. So fairness, justice means something different to every single survivor that we work with, and victims' rights are there to ensure that victims have the opportunity to participate in a meaningful way if they choose to, right? These rights that the states have enacted are there to give victims the choice in participating or not participating, in exercising their rights or not. It should not be something that the system decides for the victim, because the victim is the one that owns these rights. The rights really vary from state to state, as I mentioned earlier, but the focus is on, as mentioned, protecting victims, making sure that they get the opportunity to get information, which a lot of times is something that is very frustrating for victims. They don't know what's happening in the case, and also to participate, to get compensation, to get restitution. Today in the United States, every single state has statutory rights for crime victims, including the District of Columbia and also several territories. And as these laws were passing around the country during the victims' rights movement, and it was passing here in California also in my home state, there was a young lady named Marcy Nicholas who was studying to be a special education teacher. This was in 1983, so during the 1970s and 1980s, that victims' rights movement. So Marcy was in a bad dating relationship, which she had decided to break off. She had gone home in November for Thanksgiving to visit her family in November of 1983. And she got a call from her ex-boyfriend saying that he was going to kill himself unless she agreed to meet with him. She tried to let him know that it'll be okay, life goes on, but being the kind-hearted person that she was, she did agree to meet with him. And she left her parents' home that night, drove to his home, and as she got out of the car and was headed towards the door of his home, he ended up killing her. Law enforcement knew who did it. Her family knew who did it. He was arrested, and her parents were there for arraignment the next day, and they saw him being taken away in handcuffs. A few days after that, Marcy's family laid her to rest, and then a few days later, they went to visit her, and on their drive home, Marcy's family decided to stop at the grocery store. Her mom got out of the car and proceeded to enter into the grocery store to pick up some bread. And as she was walking into the grocery store, guess who was walking out? the ex-boyfriend was walking out. There was a bail hearing, and nobody decided to let the family know that there was a bail hearing. Nobody decided to ask the family about any of the safety concerns that they had. So although they had some statutory rights at the time, and some general rights in California, because this was the height of the victims' rights movement, Marcy's family really felt like there should be more rights to ensure that victims had more participation, more rights as they're going through the process, so that they can give input at specific moments in time, important moments, including bail hearings. So Marcy's family lobbied alongside other victims and other victim advocates from 1983 all the way to 2008, when Marcy's Law was passed in California. Marcy's Law gives victims in California 17 constitutional rights. And I'm sure Marcy's Law is familiar to a lot of you and a lot of other states, because there is a national movement passing Marcy's Law in other states, giving victims constitutional rights in those states. And the ultimate goal is really to get victims' rights in the US Constitution. Today at the federal level, we do have the Crime Victims' Rights Act, which gives victims a lot of rights, and also a mechanism for asserting those rights, but it's not at the constitutional level. But that is the ultimate goal. But two-thirds of the states, nearly two-thirds of the states today have adopted their own version of Marcy's Law in their state constitutions, guaranteeing victims' rights. And this is in large part due to the efforts of victim advocates and a nonprofit organization called Marcy's Law for All, which has been spearheading this movement. So some of you may be asking, well, we have statutory rights, why are constitutional rights important? Well, constitutional rights are important because they increase the strength, permanence, and enforceability of the rights. From a legal perspective, constitutional rights take precedence over statutory rights and other rules and regulations. So it's important for victims to have these constitutional rights. And of course, because we're talking about the whole country, it's important to note that some of the rights across the country are worded very broadly, while others are much more specific. Providing a long list. So for example, in Colorado, the victims' rights in the Constitution in Colorado is short and includes a broad statement of rights, whereas in California, my home state, we actually have 17 enumerated rights in the California Constitution, listing specific rights. Some of them are worded generally, but others are a little bit more specific. So make sure to get familiar with what your state constitution says. Just because they're broad does not mean that there's no teeth behind them. There's definitely, teeth behind them. And as victims' rights attorneys, we can help make sure that the system is respectful of those rights. But in general, the majority of these rights are focused on victim safety and protection, victim privacy, providing restitution for crime victims and making sure that they get their property returned, making sure that victims get information about the case and notice about what's going on in the case, and also providing victims with a way to provide input and to meaningfully participate in the process. So problem solved, right? Now we have statutory rights in all states and now constitutional rights in the majority of states. So let me ask you guys, does having these rights make sure that or ensure that victims' rights are enforced? And if folks can go ahead and put in the chat, why or why not? Are these rights sufficient to ensure that victims' rights are enforced in our process? Or is there more that needs to be done?
We're getting a lot of no's. Okay.
Perfect. And this was a true and false poll. And I apologize once again that it is not working, but it is no for the most part. Can somebody add why in the chat? Why is it not sufficient for us to just have these laws, both statutory and constitutional state laws giving victims rights? What's missing? So as we go through.
Sorry, Miriam. Somebody said lack of education, lack of accountability.
Exactly. So lack of education, and we'll talk about that a little bit later today. The fact that, it's not commonly known. Victims' rights are not commonly known. Lack of accountability, right? Nobody is holding those who are violating the rights accountable. So we really need to do a lot more work. And that's why I'm so excited to be here talking to all of you, because we all can collectively make a difference in ensuring that these rights are actually meaningful for crime victims. We don't want victims to feel like they're given a useless piece of paper with just words on paper. I've had victims tell me that our Marcy's Law card in California is not even worth the paper that is printed on, which is heartbreaking. Can you imagine being a crime victim and feeling like your rights are not important, that the system just ignored your rights, violated your rights without any recourse? So we'll talk a little bit later about tools that we can use to ensure that that does not happen. So some of the rights across the country are automatic rights. Meaning that the victim does not have to take a step to make sure that they request it or ask for it. However, some of the issues that we have seen with these automatic rights is that there's no guidance on how it's going to be implemented or who's going to be responsible for doing so. So for example, in California, victims have the right to have their safety considered when the judge is fixing bail or release conditions. And this would have been critical for Marcy's family, right? That's what really upset them, that they were not even notified of the bail hearing. But there's no guidance given in California as to who's responsible for getting this information from the victim and ensuring that it's in the case file and that it's relayed to the judge before the bail hearing. Most of the time, victims are not even aware that these hearings are taking place because a lot of times they take place shortly after the defendant is arraigned or at the same time sometimes. So it's important to understand that while some of the rights are automatic, we still have, very new law in most of the country and no systems in place to address this. So we want to make sure to work in our communities to create processes to ensure that we understand as a system, who's responsible for what and how this is going to be enforced. Other rights are not automatic, but have to be requested. In California, 6 out of our 17 rights actually have to be requested. However, there's no guidance given on what request means, right? How do you request these rights? Do you have to email somebody? Do you call somebody? Or do you send a fax or snail mail? When do you have to make this request by? Is there like a cutoff time or a cutoff date or hearing that you can't turn in a request by? Do you have to do so at the outset of the case? And then who do you send the request to? Do you send it to the DA? Do you send it to your advocate? Do you send it to the judge or all the parties involved? So there's very little guidance given as to what the upon request means here in California. And looking across the country, we see a lot of similarity where you do have rights where victims have to take a step to have them, requested or enforced. There's little guidance given. So make sure and look at the wording of your state constitutions and your victims' rights and understand, are the rights automatic? Are there systems in place? And if the rights have to be requested, well, what does that mean for our state, our community? Do we have a system in place? If not, let's have a discussion so that we can create processes to make sure that these rights, once again, are meaningful. But let's back up a little bit, and somebody hinted at this in the chat earlier, and consider the fact that a lot of victims are not really aware of their rights. Some states, including my own, require that victims get notified of their rights. So in California, our 17th right is actually for the victim to be informed of the rights enumerated in paragraphs 1 through 6. And that's all it says in the Marcy's Law card in our Constitution, but our penal code actually goes further and explains that law enforcement and the DA's office should provide a victim with their Marcy's Law card. So let's think about this, right? So best case scenario in California, victims have the constitutional right to be notified. So you call the police, crime just happened, police respond, police have this Marcy's Law card with them and they hand it to you as a crime victim. Is that sufficient? So this is our Marcy's Law card in California. A lot of text, right? And tiny text. And if you zoom in a little bit or look it up later after the presentation, you'll find that the upon request is actually hidden. So for those 6 rights that have to be requested, it's kind of, hidden in the middle of those rights. Additionally, this is written in legalese. This is our constitutional text written on a piece of paper. So is this meaningful notice? Is giving a victim this piece of paper sufficient for them to know, A, that these are their constitutional rights, and B, to understand what they need to do to make sure that these rights are enforced as they're going through, if they are interested in requesting the rights or having the system respect those rights. In addition, a lot of victims are handed other information, right, when they contact law enforcement. So they're handed, the police report number, the police report card, sometimes other brochures and flyers about compensation, et cetera. So, this is not going to be at the forefront of their mind, especially if they don't understand the value of the words written on this piece of paper. But if they do look at it, they're going to get very confused. And let me tell you a story, because I actually teach victims in criminal procedure at McGeorge School of Law. We're one out of a handful of law schools that actually has a course focused on victims in criminal procedure. And I give this card to third-year law students. So law students who are trained to read the law students who are sitting in a very comfortable classroom, who have not just endured trauma and were victims of crime. And they have a hard time understanding what this card means. I tell them, okay, you just received this card. What does it mean to you? And these law students are not able to decipher what these rights mean. So how are we expecting our victims, who are lay people, who have been traumatized, who have never, didn't ask to be a victim, have never had to engage with the criminal justice system before, to understand the value of this card? So a lot needs to be done to ensure that victims' rights become meaningful. And there's really no way for it to become meaningful unless we all work together. So, our mental health professionals, our system-based advocates, or community-based advocates, law enforcement, attorneys, and others work together to make sure that victims are aware of these rights. And when do rights become meaningful, right? So in order for rights to become meaningful, the first step is that victims have to be aware of them, right? People have to be asking for them, but they have to be aware of them first. And we have to have courts that are enforcing these rights. But of course, in order for us to get to that point, victims actually have to be in court asking for the rights. And we have to have systems that are routinely complying with them. We're still pretty much, unfortunately, at step one, where people are asking for the rights, because a lot of times victims are not aware of their rights. So it's important for us to really focus on that education piece. And part of education is really being transparent with victims about our role in the process. Victims don't know who's who. They unfortunately have to interact with a lot of different professionals that have a lot of different roles in the process. Some are system-based, some are not. So we want to make sure that we explain our role to crime victims when we're interacting with them, so that they understand, who we are, what we do, and then how we can help them with the rights, right? If I am a system-based advocate, then my ability to help them request the rights, enforce the rights, may be limited due to some confidentiality issues, may be limited due to some diverging interest with the DA's office, which you're ultimately part of. If I'm a community-based advocate, I can't represent the victim in court because I'm not an attorney. So it's important for us to understand our role, and also to explain that to victims, and also to explain whether or not you have confidentiality with victims, because the last thing that we want to do is to be told something that we then have to relay to the DA's office if we are a system-based player, under Brady. You also, Anna alluded to this earlier, that a lot of victims think that the prosecutor is their attorney. And we hear that on a weekly basis from victims, well, my attorney is not listening to me. My attorney is offering a plea and I don't agree with it. So we want to make sure that we explain what the role of the district attorney is. The DA is just doing their job, representing the community, right? Their focus is to ensure that the community is safe and that they seek justice on behalf of everybody in the community. So they're not representing the victim. So we want to make sure to, not set up the victim for disappointment and frustration and thinking that the DA is representing them. Because there are moments in time where the victim's interests are going to be different than the DA's interests. And that's why they have these rights. They have these rights so that they have an independent way to participate in the process, to be heard in the process. Moments where we have diverging interests between the victim and the prosecutor can be, when a plea deal is going to be offered. So the victim sometimes they don't agree with a plea being offered, but the prosecutor feels like it's in the best interest of the state to offer this plea deal. So in that moment of time, you have to look at your victim's rights to see how the victim can participate. Can they veto the prosecutor? No, but what they can do is they have the right to be heard. They have the right to confer with the prosecutor. At least here in California, they have the opportunity to meet with the prosecutor, let the prosecutor know how they feel about the plea deal, and then also to be heard by the court. They have that constitutional right to be heard by the court. They don't have to agree with the prosecutor. They still have the right to be heard by the court. Victims are independent participants in the process. They have these rights, and nobody can take those rights away from the victim. So it's important for us to make sure that we are educating victims to make sure that they know how they can participate in the process, and make sure that you understand yourself the rights and also the nuances of the rights in your state, such as what does a request mean in your state, or do you have rights that need to be requested, etc. And this will help you, no matter what your role is, in providing information to the victim and survivor that you're working with. And don't expect somebody else to do it right. Well, I'm sure that the DA's office is going to notify them, or I'm sure law enforcement gave them a card. Once again, just assume that they don't know, and provide them with information, because you may be the only person that's providing them with that information. And you may be the only person that's taking time to explain that. And that will really go a long way with victims, so that they feel that they understand their rights, they're empowered to go in and request their rights in the criminal justice system, and see their rights being respected and not violated. The vast majority of victims who are going through the criminal justice system are not going to have an attorney, and we're going to talk about victims' rights attorneys shortly. So what those victims can do, and what you can recommend that they do, is to ensure that the rights are respected, is to let the victim know that they should, at the outset of the case, notify both the DA, the prosecutor, and the system-based advocate of their intention to exercise their rights. The victim should do so in writing, right? Because sometimes it's not clear if the victims do want to participate, if they want to be notified, or if they want to be heard. Sometimes they're not really sure, there can be room for miscommunication. So you want to make sure that it's clear. So do so in writing, and then make sure that it's in the case file. So for example, if the victim requests to be heard at sentencing, and the victim's request is there in the case file, we won't have a sentencing hearing if the victim is not present, because if the victim wasn't notified in a meaningful way. So these are just kind of best practices that you can provide for victims to help them ensure that the system is respectful of their rights. In order for victims to be able to assert and enforce their rights and request appellate review down the line, victims have to have legal standing. So some state constitutions, including my own here in California, give victims an explicit right to exercise their rights in court. They also give the right to the prosecutor upon the request of the victim, and the victim's rights attorney. So while exercising the rights, victims are participants in the criminal case. Having these rights does not make them a party to the case, but they are participants with meaningful rights. And it's once again important to note that these rights are personal to the victim, right? The victim owns these rights, and the victim is the one that can request them, can have them enforced, request to have them enforced, or waive them. Say, no, I'm not interested in participating. I'm not interested in being heard. I don't want to get notification. Nobody else in the system has the right to waive the victim's rights. But unfortunately, there are situations quite often where victims' rights are violated. And victims can defend the rights, the violations of these rights, both in trial and appellate courts. And in those cases where victims' rights are violated, victims become full parties to the rights litigation piece of the case. And remedies for addressing rights violations really vary, but the victim has to pursue them in court, so generally through motion practice. And this is challenging for most victims because it means that they need legal representation. They need an attorney, which of course means resources, right? Money, attorneys cost money. So a lot of victims are not able to afford a victims' rights attorney to help them challenge victims' rights violations. Thankfully, though, across the states and there is funding both at the state and federal level for supporting criminal justice advocacy to provide pro bono attorneys for victims who are dealing with victims' rights issues. Here in California, we have the California Office of Emergency Services that supports legal services for victims in the criminal justice system through a grant. On a national level, the National Crime Victim Law Institute supports clinics around the country that are actively supporting victims through the criminal process, addressing victims' rights violations. And the Office of Victims of Crime also funds programs through their legal assistance to victims grants that also allow for victim advocacy. So there are a lot of agencies out there, more and more, thankfully, over the past few years, where victims can get connected to a victims' rights attorney. And keep in mind, this is a very new area of the law. A lot of attorneys are graduating without any knowledge of victims' rights. I mentioned earlier that only a handful of law schools that actually have a course focused on victims' rights. So don't assume that any attorney that you'll refer a victim to will be familiar with victims' rights. So you really have to have a referral policy, where you are referring victims for victims' rights issues to a person who is knowledgeable, an attorney who's knowledgeable in victims' rights issues. And if you don't know who in your community is able to help with that, please connect with the National Crime Victim Law Institute. They do have a referral list for the entire country for attorneys, and I'll have their information at the end of the presentation. So what is the role of a victims' rights attorney? As mentioned earlier, a victims' rights attorney does have standing to represent crime victims with their legal rights in criminal court. And having a victims' rights attorney, of course, is always helpful, right? Because they were trained to understand the law. They're there to help explain it to victims. They're solely focused on the victim's interest in ensuring that victims' rights are protected. And they're able to help victims assert their rights even when the language is broadly stated, right? They're able to make sure that the victim's right to privacy is protected and use tools to ensure that right is enforced, using some of the specific practices that they have. It's important to note, though, that a victims' rights attorney is not there to prosecute the case. Their role is fully just to focus on victims' rights, to file motions to protect victims' rights, and to address violations of crime victims' rights. Unfortunately, a victim does not have a constitutional right to a court-appointed victims' rights attorney currently in our system, in our criminal system here in the United States. However, a victim can hire their own attorney, which of course causes a lot of victims to not be able to have an attorney by their side because they can't afford it. They don't have the resources. But as mentioned, there are attorneys out there that offer pro bono services, and there are clinics out there and programs out there that are funded by the government, both at the federal and state level, that do offer victims' rights advocacy to crime victims. I did want to make sure that each and every one of you know that the work that you do is critical, no matter what your role is. If you're in mental health, if you are a community-based advocate, law enforcement, the work that you do in ensuring that victims get connected with a victims' rights attorney, that victims get information, right? Just basic information about their rights is really critical to making a difference in our system, is making the difference from rights that, are not worth the piece of paper that they're printed on, to victims feeling like, wow, I have rights and the system's going to respect these rights because I'm going to be proactive and ask for them. And there are agencies that can help support me. So you can do a lot in making sure that these rights become meaningful by just simply notifying victims and then working with folks in your state to make sure that these processes are created to address some of the vagueness that we talked about today. So thank you guys for all of the support that you do on behalf of victims. And really, you are making a change to affect, state system-wide changes to ensure that victims' rights become meaningful. Every little step that each of us takes really makes a big difference in the end, and we can't do it except if we work collectively together. I did want to share quickly information about the National Crime Victim Law Institute and some of the amazing resources that they have. So they do they provide technical assistance with victims' rights issues. They also provide amicus supports and they provide amazing trainings. They do provide attorney referrals through their pro bono portal. So they connect victims to pro bono victim rights attorneys and victim service providers also. And they also have a victims' rights attorney toolkit. So if you are an attorney and interested in learning more about victims' rights, that's the place to go to really expand your knowledge and grow. And they do have an amazing conference every year in June. So there's going to be a conference coming up in Portland on June 5th through the 7th. And it's a conference focused on victims' rights. So there's a QR code. Feel free to get more information by taking a picture of that or scanning it to get more information. But if you're interested in learning more about victims' rights, learning more about litigation that's happening in your states surrounding victims' rights, please check out that conference. And of course, followed by the NCVC conference, which also offers amazing workshops. And we're very excited to be attending both. But I want to give some time for questions. So we have about 14 minutes left over for questions. But I do want to thank each and every one of you for being here today. I apologize about my polls not working. There's always has to be a technical issue, so I'll take that one over any. But there's my contact information and Anna's contact information. Please feel free to reach out to us offline if there's anything that we can do to support you and assist you in the work that you're doing, empowering victims, and we're happy to take questions now as well.
Thanks so much, Miriam and Anna. So as a reminder, we have some questions in the Q&A, excuse me. I have seen some come through in the chat. The chat is moving so quickly that we cannot possibly keep up with it. So please, if you have questions, put them in the Q&A section. So the first one is, do any states' victims' rights laws have teeth? What are the consequences of violating a person's victim rights? Can you give some examples of how victims' rights laws are enforced?
Yeah, so that's a lot of questions bundled into one. So I'll break it down a little bit. When we say whether or not victims' rights have teeth, it really means enforcement of those rights. So we are seeing in states like Arizona, for example, where there is a very active victims' rights attorney community actively litigating violations. And what I want to do is to have you guys think about defendants' rights, and Miranda, for example. When did Miranda, what is it? Is it a law? It's not a law, it's a case, right? So defendants had rights and those rights were being violated. And an attorney said, okay, I'm going to, push back and say that this is not okay. This was a violation. And that's where we got the Miranda case. So then courts started paying attention, right? So we have rights now, but we don't have a lot of victims with attorneys kind of pushing back and appealing victims' rights violations or addressing them through the court process and creating case law. That's really how we can give teeth to these rights. And sorry, Krista, what was the second part of that question? An example? Yeah, so there is also at the federal level, there is, a lot of litigation happening at the federal level. And during the NCVLI conference, I know that they'll be discussing a few of those cases, including like the Boeing case, where there are, there was a pushback in court and now case law that's created that's to the benefit of victims. And courts don't want their cases overturned, right? So when courts see that a lot of these cases with victims' rights violations are being challenged and overturned or redone, they're going to check in with the victim. Right now we have a system where the judge really does not even ask, has a victim been notified of the rights in most of our country, including in California. But what we need to have happen is to have judges really pay attention to victims' rights. Was the victim notified of the rights? Ask, well, if the victim requests the rights, and not to let the case proceed without making sure that the victims were notified and are present if they requested to be present. And an example of a case where teeth was given to the victim's rights is, for example, there are cases where the defendant was offered a plea deal. And the victim had requested to confer with a prosecutor. The victim did not get the opportunity to confer with a prosecutor. The plea deal was offered, and the plea deal was accepted by the court. The victim said, "This is not right. This was in violation of my right because I had the right to confer with a prosecutor." With the assistance of an attorney, that plea deal got thrown out because it was, accepted in violation of the victim's constitutional right. And that's why that constitutional right is important, right? Because these are really important rights that are very difficult to pass and very difficult to overturn. So because of that violation of the victim's constitutional right, the court threw out the plea deal and then basically had a redo of the process. But that's an excellent question. And feel free to reach out to us for more information about cases specific to your state.
Thanks, Miriam. The next question is, how do you see these rights working in the post-conviction process? Prison, supervision, et cetera.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Once again, because victims' rights don't stop after the person is sentenced, right? Victims have rights post-sentencing. And it really depends on your state and the wording of the Constitution in your state. A lot of times victims have the right to notice of parole hearings, of release, of escape. From custody. Victims also have the right to restitution, and a lot of times they collect restitution after once the person is sentenced and after they're released. So some of the rights do happen post-sentencing. Here in California, a lot of them have to be requested. So the victim actually has to contact agencies to get notification, has to contact agencies to request to be heard at parole hearings. So we want to make sure that we read the language and understand the language of our Constitution so that we can advise the survivor or victim that we're working with accordingly, because a lot of times they do have rights, but those rights the victim has to take a step to make those rights actually be enforced.
What of victims' rights in this era of many criminals being released and cases dropped? So few even being charged.
Yeah, so that's a tough one. And I think that should be something that's on all of our radars. We are in a point in time now where there's a lot of talk of criminal justice reform and using less incarceration, more rehabilitative type ways to address harm. And a lot of the DAs have a vast amount of discretion in charging, but victims still you have to look at your Constitution. Here in California, victims have the right to confer with a prosecutor even if charges are not filed. They have the right to understand why were charges not filed. And the system has to provide them with that information. In terms of the person being released early or being offered a plea that the victim may not agree with, victims have the right to be heard. They have the right here in California. They also have the right to provide input to the probation when they're putting together the pre-sentence report. So we want to make sure that victims are exercising all of their rights, providing input. Right, that's why they have these rights, is to be able to engage with the system, to be able to provide their perspective to the system players. And then ultimately, the judges are the ones that make these decisions about, whether or not a plea is fair, if charges are going to be dropped, et cetera. But victims have the right to participate and to be heard during all of those processes.
All right, the next one. Not sure if there's a true answer to this question, but any advice on navigating the development and/or pushback of victims' rights in tribal communities and courts?
So there's a lot of misconception about victims' rights, and Anna alluded to this earlier. So I think, in terms of pushback, understanding the reason behind the pushback, like, are they concerned that there's going to be an administrative burden that's going to slow down the process? Do they understand the value to the victim in having these rights? So would definitely love to connect with you and connect some of our, national experts in this conversation, because I think it's an important one. And I think, kind of addressing those misconceptions about, the end result of giving victims rights in the process will hopefully help allow the system to be more accepting of these rights. But what we're asking the system to do, it's a big change, right? We're asking the system to go from a two-party system to a system where now victims have rights that they can exercise in the process. But understanding the value and the impact, the long-term impact that this has not only to the victim but to our system, I think goes a long way, and hopefully will allow people to be more open to making sure that these rights are available to victims and that they become meaningful. And in the end, these are laws on the books. And a lot of times these are constitutional laws on the book. So the system does not have the right to turn a blind eye to it. And that's really why we have to have attorneys by victim sides, pushing, and then litigating violations, because that's the only way that the system ultimately will understand that these rights are serious and that we will see long-term change.
Right. The next one I think is very timely. California is able to support immigrant victims without fear of immigration status. How can we support immigrant victims in states that don't support immigrants or have sanctuary laws?
That's a tough question for sure. And I know a lot of, immigrants who are undocumented are concerned about even contacting the police because they are concerned about the repercussions. And I think it just depends on the state and what the policies are in that state in terms of enforcement. Like, is it going to put the victim in a worse situation if they do engage with the system? And sometimes it's important for victims to make that decision, right? Does it make sense for me to contact the police and expose myself to these types of, liabilities, deportation, et cetera? Or should I not engage with the criminal justice system? What's important for victims to understand is, the ramifications of contacting law enforcement. And, once that ball is rolling, the criminal justice system ball is rolling, the victim can't stop it, right? The victim can't drop charges. It's up to the state, right? Because it's the state versus the defendant, not the victim versus the defendant. The victim's not a party to the case. So I think explaining the options to the victim or survivor that you're working with, and then understanding in your community, what has happened in the past and what are the possible repercussions of moving forward.
What is the benefit of constitutional amendments versus statutes?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And I touched on that briefly, right? So if you look at the priority of the laws in the United States, constitutional laws are the top, right? So they trump statutory law. And that's why it's important, right? There's more power. And then also it's much harder to pass constitutional law. So constitutional rights, and it's much harder to change them. And that's why it's important for us to have these constitutional rights, because it has a lot more weight and a lot more power, and the system should be much more respectful of the constitutional rights when victims have them. But once again, if the victims are not aware of them and they're not asking for them in court, then they're not going to be enforced.
All right, I think we should have time for two more. If we did not get to your question, we're going to send all the questions in the Q&A to Miriam and Anna, and hope that they want to provide us some answers that we can then send out to the rest of the group. So is there anything that says defense attorneys need to question and cross-examine victims with dignity and respect? Then they go on to talk about defense attorneys being very nasty to especially victims of childhood sexual abuse.
Yeah, and that's an excellent question. And I think, some of those broad rights that we talked about, the right to be treated with respect and dignity, a victim's rights attorney can use those broad rights to help address some of the ways that the victim is dealt with. But some states, actually, the victim can refuse to even speak to the defense attorney unless the victim is, subpoenaed in court. But if the defense attorney or investigator reaches out to a victim, the victim has the right to refuse. And that right is included in California. Victims don't have to speak to the defense attorney or an investigator, but that doesn't mean that they identify themselves. So I think it's important for you also to look at your laws and see if your states do offer that type of protection for the victim, and then let the victim know that the defense attorney is not going to contact you and say, I'm calling you from the defense team firm, and I want to get information that's going to help me defend the person in this case. A lot of times here in California, we we see them identifying themselves as, I'm calling from the DA's office or the PD's office, DA meaning defense attorney, but the victim thinks it's district attorney, PD, meaning public defender, the victim thinks police department. So I would start by looking at your laws. Do your laws provide protection specifically against the defense contact? If yes, then great, the victim can move forward and say and refuse. If no, then some of those broad rights, right, the right to be treated with fairness and respect, et cetera, the victim's rights attorney can help use those to craft arguments to stop that type of behavior.
All right, and our last question, I think this is a good note to end on. How or where can we collectively continue to communicate to increase this work for increasing victims' rights?
Oh, I love that question. And I love the fact that it does highlight the fact that we need to work together as communities to make these rights meaningful. We need to work together, no matter what our role is. I mean, you have so much power to make a difference. And I think the NCVLI conference, which is coming up in June, is really the conference that's focused on victims' rights. And for me, honestly, like the work that we do, that all of us do, is difficult, right? And it is heavy. And going to that conference is really empowering because you see other people that are, actively litigating these issues. You learn about what different communities are doing to make sure that victims' rights are meaningful. So I think that's one place to start. And I know they're hosting community conversations also all around the country. So I would definitely contact them, and feel free to reach out to me and I can put you in touch with them. But I love that question, and thank you for all the work that you guys do on behalf of victims and for your interest in making victims' rights a reality.
Well, thank you so much, Miriam and Anna. Fantastic presentation, as we knew it would be. We're so grateful that all of you decided to spend your afternoon with us. As a few of us mentioned in the chat, the recording of this session and the PowerPoint, as well as any other question answers or documents that Miriam and Anna have, will be sent out to everyone that's registered for the webinar. So be on the lookout for those to come in the next few days. And just as another reminder, please think about joining us at NTI in Boston, September 6th through 8th. Miriam and Anna will both be there in person, so you can ask them all of your many questions about victims' rights during a lunch break. We'd love to see you there. If you have any questions about the conference, please feel free to reach out to us as well, or go to our website at victimsofcrime.org. We hope to see you next month at our next session. Have a great afternoon.